Hey guys, how are you doing? This is Zed from Zed Outdoors and I hope you're having an awesome day. So today I'm with a dear friend of mine, Yoav. Yoav, how are you doing?
Hey man, I'm good. Thanks.
So Yoav is a very well-respected international craftsman. So we are at Brookhouse Woods in the county of Herefordshire, the west of England, run by Will St. Clair. This is a very famous location where Will runs a slew of training courses and Yoav being one of the resident instructors here. So in this particular video, what we're going to be looking at is Yoav's process for turning a bowl on a foot-powered lathe. Now, many different craftspeople have their own variations of their technique. Yoav is very well respected for the work he does on the lathe, on a foot-powered lathe. He turns a slew of items. You turn bowls, cups, boxes, lidded boxes, etc. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's the sort of range of items I usually turn, and then added a few bits and bobs, but yeah, bowls, small ones and bigger ones, cups, end grain cups, which I just recently started turning more efficiently and feeling more comfortable with the process. And then since last year, lock and lid boxes, which are this sort of type of items.
What we'll do, we'll actually do a zoom up. I think it will be worth doing a zoom up in a second of this particular item, so you can see the quality of Yoav's work. I'm a proud owner of some of Yoav's work, and it's incredibly beautiful. I really do mean that. So Yoav is very kindly taking time out to film with me and to share his process. And so what we're going to do in this video is going to be quite a detailed video, as you can see by the length of this video, in terms of the methodical process Yoav works through, from literally taking a raw piece of wood to a finished product. And Yoav is going to be sharing his tips and techniques along the way. Yoav does teach us professionally, so he does know what he's talking about. Now, a couple of things I do want to preface to this just before we get started looking at some of the examples is I've recorded a video with Sharif Adams, which has been a very well received video, which is a beginner's guide to the foot-powered bowl lathe, which is looking at the tools, the lathe itself, etc. So needless to say, as well as putting links to the location here where I'm at, to Yoav, etc., there will be a link to that video should you want to look at kind of building your own lathe, etc. One thing I will also mention is at this location, Yoav, along with Will St. Clair, do teach how to build your own lathe and teach everything in person. So I just want to kind of set the foundation in case you're worried about how you kind of set up your own lathe and all the things that go with it. So with your kind permission, Yoav, what we're going to do now, we're going to look at some of Yoav's work, and then we're going to get straight into a process where Yoav is going to be teaching you how to turn a bowl on a foot-powered lathe. So Yoav, this is some of your work then that we're looking at here. Would you want to talk us through these pieces?
Yeah, I mean, these I don't tend to have a lot of the items I make in my van, in my home. So these are just the stuff I kept for some reason. So that's just these two are used items from my home. So that's a small older bowl with a bit of milk paint. And this is a double tiered lock and lid box, which I started turning after last year's course with Jared Dahl, when he came actually to this place to teach a more advanced course, I guess. So that's a bit of leftover nuts.
To those who may not be familiar with the concept of a lock and lid box, so it's basically, so it's just the
yeah, it's this is made from beech. The orientation of the grain is quite important in the lock and lid boxes, so you want the grain running sort of perpendicular to the surface, and that will prevent the warpage. It'll keep it into the minimum. So you can see, maybe here you can see it a bit better, that it's relatively flat. There's a little bit of a kink and warp here, but it's relatively flat, and that allows the lid, or in this case the next box up, to sit really nicely on the rim and create this nice seal with a lock and lid mechanism.
Right.
As opposed to, so this is as opposed to splitting wood tangentially and then having this quite extreme warpage, so obviously a lid won't sit flat and nice on this rim in this orientation of grain. So yeah, you can see the growth rings here. So that was half a log, whereas this is a very specific piece from a bigger sized log where the grain is running nice and straight and perpendicular to the surface.
Perfect. And then lastly, your cup.
Yeah, and then this is a end grain cup. So by end grain I mean that your orientation of the grain is running up, and I'm cutting through the end grain. So you know, essentially, if this was the log, the cup was standing as it is now, whereas a bowl will be standing like that. So it's a bit more. I found it quite tricky. Hollowing out, especially, it needs a bit of a different tools, and again Jared was very helpful in that, and he's a very sharing teacher and a fellow craftsman. He's really, for me, is a big inspiration, the way he shares everything he knows from years of experience and just putting it out there. And I'm trying to do the same, sort of, people coming on courses or asking questions, I always try and help as much as I can, because I feel by improving people's skills, that pushes me to keep improving as well and not get stuck in my own little niche, or I'm always trying to improve. So yeah, that's just an end grain cup. The nice thing about end grain is that you can turn really thin walls, really delicate pieces that feels good in the mouth and also look very elegant, I think, but retaining the strength. So you can see it's still, it's nice and flexible because of the long grains. After it's sealed, I use it for hot drinks, cold drinks, whatever. Yeah, it's really nice drinking from wooden cups.
So as we move into the rest of this tutorial, the one thing I forgot to mention is this is a working woodland. So you're going to hear machinery in the background, processing timber, etc. So my apologies in advance if that interferes with the recording of this video. Also, this is a prelude to a big event, the bowl gathering, which is a wooden bowl gathering of different forms and techniques from teachers all over the world. So it's going to be a very busy environment. So enjoy the rest of this video. So Yoav?
Yeah?
We're now going to be axing out the blank. So is there a particular type of timber that you typically go for?
No, it's usually I use what I have at hand. So we get a nice supply of sycamore and some beech this year, so that's what I'm using. I like semi-hard. I don't like turning softwood. I think it's quite hard to get a nice finish on softwood, whereas it's really nice learning on it. So now when I'm trying to sell most of the bowls, I tend to go on the harder woods. So this specific one is beech from last year. It's been laying around in the parking for a year and is now slightly spalted, which is good. I'm not very keen on very figured wood. I tend to work with like sycamore is really nice and shiny and plain, and I find that the form shines out if the wood isn't so busy. In this case, it's going to be quite the opposite. So it's going to be quite a lovely looking grain, which will hopefully not distract too much from the form, where the thing that I'm more interested in.
So is it quite green, or do you let it season just slightly?
So this one is quite seasoned. So again, it was cut a year and a half ago and been sitting here in the parking in the round, so it retains most of the moisture, but it is mellowed down a lot, and that will give a nicer finish. But it does take a much more work for the tools and for the hands, so that means I need to sharpen more often, and it'll be a bit of a harder work, but it's worth it for the end product. As I said, the greener and the softer it is, the less likely you'll get a really crisp finish, whereas if the wood is slightly mellowed, a bit harder, and you use sharp tools, you'll get really nice crisp cuts, where that's what I'm interested in. So it's worth mentioning that I'm not sanding any of them or any of my work. It's straight off the tool, so I need to find the wood that reacts nicely with the process I'm looking for, you know, the process I'm trying to apply on it.
So with this one here,
so that was I cut the length last night and then split it just so it doesn't start cracking. So this is 1/2 of the round, and then you can see that it's slightly wider to the side grain than it is longer on the end grain. In this case it's a bit of an extreme, but it's always better to aim for a wider blank than a longer one, and I'll explain why. When we scribe the bowl, so I'm looking for the center, slightly bigger. So this is my center. I'm gonna lock the dividers, and if this is my center point of the bowl, I'm reaching all the way to the end grain on this side, all the way to the end grain on this side, right to the edge, but I have plenty of material in the side grain. So again, this case is a bit of an extreme. I don't want to turn too much of a too big of a bowl because it will take longer. So I just cut it into a reasonable size, and then with having the side grain, having all the excess material on the side grain and not on the end grain, means, ooh, the dividers went out a bit. Means that I can cleave the axis really easily, whereas cutting to end grain, if you imagine there's axis wood here, cutting into that end grain to shape the bowl blank will be much harder than simply using a froe and cleaving that axis material. So froe, mallet, right above that scribing, and by, you know, a simple whack I remove all that axis really easily. So it's always, you know, ideally you'll hit all 4 faces with your scribe, but if anything you want it wider, you want a wider piece of wood than it is longer on the end grain.
right?
So same on the other side, just above that scribe. Hopefully it doesn't run off, and that's fine. And then start shaping with an axe. So I'm gonna start just making these 2 sides nice and in a 90 degree to the end grain. So the process of axing out a blank, I took most of it from who taught me to do, you know, to turn bowls to begin with, which is Sharif Adams. Like I said, mentioned, there's a video with him as well. Do check it out. Yeah, he's definitely done something right with me if I'm still turning and enjoying it. So we have probably a few similarities in the process, mainly because he was my teacher. So I'm starting with just cutting nice and straight down, and then other side. Okay, so I reached the lines of the scribe. I don't know if you can see it. I might. So that's my scribing just there. Hopefully you can see it a bit better now. And then same here. I reached all the way to that scribing. And now I'm actually ignoring that scribe and turning it other way around. So I'm going to reach that scribing, that bowl shape from the back by axing in a methodical way that will hopefully keep it as balanced and even as possible. If I'll try rounding it off to begin with, I'll probably end up with something that is really unbalanced, really uneven, because it's quite hard for our eyes to create something round from, you know, an organic shape. So if I'll stay with nice big flat faces and facets, I'll have more control on where I need to remove more material. So I'm starting by just cleaning that bark, and then I usually do it by eye, but just for the sake of the video I eyeball center point more or less, and then that will be the base of the bowl, the foot. Just a rough idea, I don't know, maybe 2" in general. And then that gives me a reference point to how I'll be axing. So I'm starting with one corner, just a flat surface. I'm walking towards the corner and then matching the other side. And you can hear that the wood is quite dry. It's definitely not on the very green side of it, which is nice. It leaves a nice finish from the axe, and already from this point I can have a better idea of, you know, how it will behave on the lathe. You know, that's why I like roughing out bowls with an axe. It just gives me a very good idea of how the wood behaves under a sharp edge. If it was really fluffy at this stage, I might reconsider you know, shaping it into a blank. I might let it mellow down a bit and then shape it again and put it on the lathe. I want to try and achieve a really nice finish from start to finish. I don't stop and let it dry in between the process like you might do with the spoons, for example, where you carve 90% of the spoon green, let it dry, and then do finishing cuts. In my way of process, I just try and do it in one go. So I did 2 corners. I'm matching 2 other corners. Always cutting towards the end grain, so I'm cutting towards that direction. I'm not cutting towards the side grain just yet. And by doing just big flat cuts and keeping it, you know, very, you know, simple. So I'm just doing 4 corners at the minute. I'm not trying to round anything. It's really easy to see which side I need to work on more, so I get an even blank right from the first stage. So at the minute you can see that it's that side is deeper than that one, so I'll go back to this side and just match it up. Ooh. So that's slightly better, it's quite even. And then same here, it's even, but it's not necessarily matched to this side, so a bit steeper. It's quite important seeing where your holding hand is as well, so I wouldn't, you know, put my thumb or hands anywhere near the center line. I keep it, you know, nice and tucked behind, as safe as possible. Nice slicing cuts. And you know, we're aiming for perfect, but we won't get there. So at some point we need to say, okay, that's good enough for me, and next bowl blank will might be better. But yeah, there's a tendency to try and do things perfect all the time, and I think it's better just to do repetition, just do it again and again, and you know, it'll come to a stage where it's good enough to put on the lathe. We're not trying to do a carved bowl, we're trying to get a blank to turn. So obviously the nicer it is, the better, but at some point we just need to say, alright, next stage. So next stage is going to be cutting down this ridge, so this one and this one. So now I'm gonna take down those two ridges, starting from my marked point. The only sort of really noisy day in the woods, we're filming a bowl turning tutorial. Yeah. That's the way. Usually you hear, usually there's birds, not tractors. Yeah, it is quite a busy time in the workshop, both in the woodland, sort of making firewood for next year, and in the workshop for the bowl gathering. So I took down those two ridges. It's a bit, you can see it's quite slopey. I'll try and fix that now. So I'm trying to get a parallel face, and at the minute it's a bit slopey here. So cutting into the side grain, you need to be much more careful. It's very easy to, if you go too steep of an angle, you'll create a crack, and all of that will just cleave out. So by cutting to the side grain, I'm cutting really shallow cuts. If I'll go any steeper, it'll just it'll act as a wedge and split that side grain. Slightly better. So now I have 3 big faces on each side, and now I'll break those smaller ridges I created. So we're creating a ridge, breaking it into smaller ridges, breaking them, and slowly we'll create a little bowl shape, a bit like a football, where it's a round thing but it's created from flat sort of faces. Does that make sense? So breaking that ridge, now breaking this ridge. Then the 2 on the other side. And you can see that the whole time I didn't even look once here. So I know that my bowl is touching those 4 sides. All I need to do is reach it from the corners and see the bowl from sort of a bird's eye view. So now I'll start working on these ridges, the ones close to the end grain. So that, and start matching them to the end grain side I've been working on. Again, shallower cuts when I'm working on the side grain. A bit more. And then just cleaning off this bark and seeing the curve, the natural curve of the log. So again, it's lower here than it is here. So I need to work more on this side. Just take it down. And I think I'll make it slightly shallower. So I'm gonna take some of the base just took the whole thing slightly towards the front face, the top face, just to have a slightly shallower bowl, because I know what shapes I like, and that was too small to be that deep, so I just pushed it a bit so it'll be closer to a shape that I'm trying to chase and create. And then back to breaking those ridges again, just very light cuts, very methodical way of cutting. I'm not going all over the place. I'm doing, you know, each face, doing a full round, making sure that I'm doing more or less the same sort of swings and using the same sort of force on all of the bowl. That will help the bowls stay even as possible. Oh, it's a bit more quiet now. Also, I'm trying to work in a nice rhythm. I'm not working, I think there's a tendency especially with beginners, to work really fast and inefficient, whereas if you slow down a bit, just hit where you're aiming and maintain a reasonable rhythm, that's actually much more, I find it much more efficient than working, you know, really fast and inaccurate. So almost completing this round, and you can see that with every turn I'm pushing that bowl towards the top face, and that will be, you know, when it's that thick, that thin I should say, I can easily take it down from this face right to the scribe. So I'm pushing it from the back, and once it's in a reasonable thickness, I can then work my way from looking at the scribe and chasing that line. It's all good, Zed?
I'm looking good so far, Yoav.
Yeah. You want to turn a bowl now? It seems like hard work to me. It's actually a good way starting off a day, axing, you know, a few bowl blanks in a row, a nice warm up, and then just chuck them in the shavings, and they can wait for a good few days. And then you can just enjoy the turning, sort of one bowl after another instead of stopping. And
so is that what you typically do then? You axe a few, leave it in the shavings, and then...
That's what in my mind I typically do, but this summer I didn't turn any bowls, almost. But yeah, that's the method. When I do turn, I try and axe a few bowl blanks, put them in the shavings, and then I can sort of concentrate on the flow on the lathe, rather than switching between axe block and lathe. It's not the best blank I've ever made, but it's reasonable. So you can see from just looking from that side, you can already see the bowl. And again, I didn't look on the scribing once. I don't need to. I know that if my bowl is here, 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 and here, I can just chase down those corners. So just a bit more. Now I'm working a bit more by eye, so I'm looking at it, seeing where I need to remove more material, so it's less of a methodical approach in the last sort of refinements. And it might be also because I'm less concentrating, and you know, I'm speaking, and it's easy to sort of axe too much and end up with something that isn't necessarily even and perfect. So now I'm just trying to fix all of that. Yeah, it's a bit weird. See what comes out from it. It's nice wood, cuts really nicely. So now that I got all 4 corners down to this thickness. I can trace it down looking on the scribe. So you won't see these two, but then you can see the other two. So I'm just chasing that line.
And you're going across the grain, aren't you?
Yeah, so now because it's so, I don't have a lot of material, I can allow, you know, it's possible to cut towards that end grain and slightly even, you know, perpendicular to that grain. But I need to be careful, just be sensitive to, you know, how the axe reacts with the wood. And stop before I split. So same on the other side, just chasing that line. You can see how relatively easy it is just to get right to that scribing line and stop in my initial end grain where I scribed all the way to the end of the log. And then other side. Then last corner. And this cuts out. They're tricky mainly because it's hard to keep the bowl blank steady. So it tends to bounce and move as it gets rounder and rounder. But yeah, that's more or less the last cut. So you need to just be patient and find that place where it sits nicely on the block. You can chase that line. And now I can have a better idea of what sort of bowl I produced. It's not great. I'll make it a bit shallower. Again, I just tend to work to a specific sort of shape, and this one isn't really matching it, so it'll be a sort of a compromise for the sake of the demonstration.
So Yoav, what's next in the process?
So we got the bowl roughed out with an axe, and it's relatively balanced. It's okay. I'll put it in the vise just to drill the hole for the mandrel. I'm using a push fit mandrel, so sort of a tenon and a mortise mandrel rather than a spiky one. So I need to drill a hole to accommodate that mandrel. I'm using a 1-inch auger. Just clean. Have my assistant sighting me on the side. So I want it to be as sort of perpendicular to the surface as I can, but if it's slightly off, I can still sort of adjust it on the lathe. So it doesn't need to be too deep. Just have a look. Maybe just one more spin. So you want the mandrel to be nice and catch it really nice and tight, so if you do catch on the lathe, it doesn't snap out and destroys the centering. Then you need to start all over again, basically. So just looking, it seems okay.
So this is your choice of mandrel then?
Yeah. So this is the core of a bigger bowl. So that will essentially it's nesting. So that's the smaller bowl out of a bigger bowl. unfortunately I just didn't have the time to turn it, and you can see that it started cracking, just drying out. So I'll just chop through that and release the mandrel so I can put it in the new blank. So yeah, it's nice to see how it sits in. The mandrel sits in the bowl. Then taking my new blank and bashing it in all the way until you hear that really dry sort of sound, and make sure that it's sitting just nice and tight, there isn't any play in it. Then that's ready to go on the lathe. So the first thing we'll do is we have a set center on the mandrel. So the mandrel is essentially perfect. It was turned on the lathe as well. So it's a perfect cylinder. And we have a center from the time that I turned the mandrel. So we have that as a center point, but obviously we don't have anything here. So first thing to do is just find that center.
So we have your lathe here, and so you're trying to find a center point, is that correct?
Yeah, so this is actually a new lathe we built on the last course. I didn't use it yet. Should be working good, but it'll be a nice experiment. So I'm putting the center and the mandrel in the center of the lathe. So those are the centers. And then I need to find, I'm ignoring the cord, I just need to find where my center of the back of the bowl is. So I'm just with a bit of force from my right hand, and I'm giving it a little spin, and I can see that it's really far from turning perfect. So catching the low point, so if you see there's a high point and low point, I tend to catch the low point of the mandrel and raise it up a bit. That's closer. And once again, that's good enough. Again, you can make it perfect, but that's already good enough for turning. So I'm gonna whack with the mallet, just marking that spot near all the rest of the searches so I'm not confused. And then putting a drop of just oil, vegetable oil, any oil, doesn't really matter.
And this is to stop it burning, is that correct?
Just to help with the friction. So it's under a lot of tension. We want it to spin nice and easily. And then I'm gonna wrap it. In this particular setup, it's wrap it twice around the mandrel, and then just put it back in that center. So give it another little whack, and then get those wedges on the poppets. Just make sure that it's all nice and secured. Oh, it's so much quiet now. This is what we're used to here. So yeah, now with the stroke down, the bowl turns towards me, and the stroke up, it just comes back. It does sort of about 2 or 3 full rotations. So essentially I'm cutting in a spiral, but if I'll keep that spiral really nice and tight, it will look like perfect rounds. So I'm gonna turn the outside of the bowl first, finish it, and then I'm committing to that shape, and then I'll flip it around and do the inside of the bowl. So I'm gonna start turning the outside now. I'm gonna use, you can appreciate my really nice sheaths.
Is that a custom made sheath?
Yeah, it's handmade. I don't really like sharing where I get the material from. It's really special.
Okay. So everyone watching will have to sign a confidentiality agreement.
yeah. I'm using a tool that I forged. I think I just forged it in the beginning of the summer forged a batch for the courses and saved a few just to try. Every time I forge, I change some things, and this seemed to work sweet. We'll see if it still does. It's an internal bevel, spring steel. Yeah, just a little turning hook. It does a lot of work, this tiny little edge. So it might be sharpened all the way from here to here, but actually I'm going to use just a few millimeters. So it's quite amazing what, you can imagine cutting a whole bowl with just the tip of the molar, how much work that edge goes through. And that it's a good way of explaining people how often they need to sharpen their tools to get a nice finish, because essentially you're cutting a whole bowl, miles of material with a tiny hook. So I'll start just from the base. I'll do a few passes which are just it's roughing out. It's trying to hit only the high spots from my quite crude rough axe work. So it's going to be quite quick passes, just taking those high spots, and then with every pass it will be smoother and smoother. I think that's how it usually is, at least. Again, I didn't use this lathe. I just tried it yesterday just to see that it's more or less as I hope it was. But yeah, everything is a bit different, so it's interesting for me as well. Trying this new setup. The tool rest is a bit in a diagonal, which I don't know if it's good or not, but I'm always sort of searching for adaptations so my posture is good, and perhaps this will be a design that we incorporate it next year. I'm barefoot as well. Sorry, all the safety people. I'm almost always turning barefoot. I never do axe work or stuff like that barefoot. Chainsawing sometimes. So I'm starting from the base, just hitting those high spots. And you can hear that I'm not doing a full cut. It's not a full rotation yet of a cut. It's just hitting those high spots, and yeah, you can see it quite obvious so I didn't cut anything here, which is a low spot from the axe, but I cut quite a lot on the other side of it, which was higher. I'm using the hook. Yeah, we'll talk about it soon, but the orientation of the hook is probably the thing that people find the most hard to understand in the beginning, how the tool actually works. Why do I keep on catching, or why do I not cut anything? Is the two extremes, and it's usually the case with beginners. They're on one of those sides, whereas there's a really sweet spot in between catching and not cutting anything, and that's what we're trying to aim for most of the process. So all the way to the rim, and that's my first roughing out pass. Yeah, so a bit of talk about what I'm actually doing is if we reference the tip of the hook, can you see that good? Tip of the hook is my sort of a clock, the hands of a clock. I think I took this way of explaining from Ben Orford, which has quite a good video. It was the only video available a few years ago, and I think that makes things quite clear. It's different tools, it's quite different process, but I use the same language. So that's the 12 o'clock. tip up, that's 3 o'clock, that's 6, that's 9, and that's 12 again. So somewhere between 12 o'clock and 2 o'clock is a very sweet spot. I would say that with every tool is slightly different because of the different angle, different curves. You need to find that angle, and what tends to happen is people starting at 12 o'clock, not cutting anything, so back of the tool against the face we're cutting, not cutting anything, and slowly introducing that edge, and very fast and a bit, you know, in impatience because it's very exciting that it's starting to cut. They reach to 3 o'clock, which is gonna catch and create really crude cutting. If you manage to cut, it'll be very aggressive, but usually what happens when you reach the 3 o'clock, it's just gonna catch and snap a tool or just create a big thing. So there's a really sweet spot between 12 o'clock is much closer to cutting than 3 o'clock is to cutting sweetly. That is very easy. It's very easy to cut, but you'll end up catching all the time. Unless you have really good control, you're able to cut at 3 o'clock, but I never reach that point. So it's 12. The thing is, it's not 12 and it's not 1 or 2, and you don't have a minute hand. So that's where sort of those tiny searches begin. And you know, you say, you know, maybe sweetest point is 12:43, but then you don't have a minute hand. So how do you find that? You just need to search really slowly. So that's 12 o'clock, back of the tool, right on the face of the bowl where I want to cut, and I'm slowly twisting my right hand and opening that angle, showing the bevel to the bowl, to the material I want to cut. And once it starts cutting, just the slightest cut, that's where I'm gonna stay the whole time. Again, I think the rhythm you work in is quite important. I'm not trying to work too fast or too slow, just nice steady rhythm. So another pass. And you can hear how it becomes a fuller cut. So it's almost the whole cutting the whole bowl at the minute. So I have just that spot where it's not cutting anything. Hopefully you can see that. And I'm just pushing that cut all the way to the rim. It's important to understand also that it's not a full pivot action. So everything is moving with every cut. It is tiny pivots. So I'm doing a pivot, just a small pivot, and then moving the whole thing, adjusting, and then another small pivot. But it's quite hard, you know, if you see, you wouldn't guess that I'm doing tiny pivots. It looks like, you know, one whole motion, but actually I'm putting the tool and cutting a tiny pivot and just using that sort of motion. Obviously I'm exaggerating now. And then moving in another small pivot, trying to follow the shape of the bowl. If I'll just do one big pivot, I'll end up with a really sort of concave shaped form of a bowl, which is, you know, it's fine, but it's not what I'm aiming for at this one specifically. Woodworkers here in the workshop this time of the year. So now that is roughed out. I didn't touch the base yet, so now I'm going to create a little foot. Still with the same, I'm still using just that one hook. So I'm going to push that foot slightly. You can do it in several ways. When I teach, usually I show one option, just not to confuse people. Just take this, video, and in general, there's many ways of doing everything. This is one option. So I'll use the same hook for this. You can also use the tip down hook for this. So maybe I'll start with this, and then perhaps I'll introduce the second tool. It's a bit of a more scraping cut.
This is very much at 12 o'clock, using your analogy, yeah?
Yeah. So this is 12 o'clock, back of the tool facing the face I'm cutting. There's a slight movement, I think. That center has a slight flex in it, even though it's really big diameter. Oh, rain's coming, as usual. So I'm just creating a little foot, and you can hear that this face is just axed. It's rough. That's why it's. You can hear that sort of not full. Those. That's the high spots hitting the tool. So I'm trying to be as stable as possible with this hand, just making sure that the tool is in control. If I let the bowl, if I let that surface be in control, I'll end up with a bowl with loads of ridges. So I need to be quite firm. Just push. And what I'm creating now is that little stump that I'll be cleaning with a hook knife by the end of the bowl. If we manage to make a bowl, it's not always. So that's one option of doing that stump. Thing is, that's a really big. I don't want this as my base. I want a little foot. So I'll start breaking that corner and sort of getting a nice flow from the bottom. So at the minute it's flat, and then the side of the bowl is straight over, where I want a really defined foot. So I need to go on the base. And just, I'm pushing that base and creating one continuous curve rather than a big flat. And once more. And now I'll mark where I want my foot. So that's going to be sort of the button or the stump that will be cleaned, but now I want a defined foot underneath that form, that curve. So another bit of a scraping cut. again, this is my sort of roughing out tool, so I'm doing all the big material removal with this, and then I'll swap to a nicely sharp one just to finish everything off. So I push that foot, and then get that curve. Yeah, so now I have a more defined foot, and I can create a little concave so it sits nicely on a surface. So with this cut, so now I'm trying to do a bit of a concave on the foot, so my reference point now, because that's the face I want to cut, my reference point is now that's my new 12 o'clock, which is, if you'll notice, really similar to 3 o'clock here, but it's a different face. So I want to cut in, essentially it's like a little bowl, that would be the mandrel or core, and that's the rim, and I want to cut a little concave, so the contact point would be, I'll have less contact point when it sits on a table, and then even if it warps, it will act as a tripod, you know, it will sit anyway. So 12 o'clock to this face is looking like this, and it's quite a tricky cut. You can catch quite easily if you're going too much out and trying to remove too much material, you'll catch. You need to be starting just 12 o'clock, just rubbing the back of the tool on the face, and then slowly rotating until you get the tiniest cut, and then just go with that. If you try and cut too much, you're just very likely to catch. So just the tiniest curl, that's enough for us. And just push it towards that little stump. So now I got the foot, I got the concave. I'm relatively happy with that shape. I'm not going to be too fussy with the form at the minute. It's mainly to demonstrate the process. Mm-hmm. So, you know, if I was to, you know, be alone and then without the, you know, just trying to produce bowls for sale, I would perhaps do a few more turns and be, you know, chase a sweeter form. At the minute I'll swap tools to a similar tool, only sharper, and try and refine that with a passer tool. I swap tools, it looks essentially, it's the same tool, bevel up, tip up, left hand inner bevel. This one, the only difference is this one I keep sharp and do the finishing cuts with. So it's just so I don't need to stop mid-bowl, sharpen frequently. I can do roughing out with one tool, then last passer tool with this sharp tool, and then I'll switch back to that rough tool for the inside of the bowl and do the same. So yeah, there's nothing really more special about this one. Just the fact that it's kept sharper. So one more pass, and you can see also with the type of cuts it creates that it's much finer. I keep my distance a bit more. I'm taking just the tiniest curls, just trying to, you know, have a little fix on the form rather than taking loads of material. So just trying to adjust really specific points that I find, you know, I see jumping into my eyes. I'm gonna remove a bit more material here, and you can see that tiny little pivot. And then I'll create a little more refined, a little mark, a little band of material to separate the bottom of the bowl and what will be the rim. It's really subtle, but you know, if you pay attention, you'll see it. That's the sort of details I like. And then from that band I just created, crazy time. I'll do a little concave sweep up. So now I'll incorporate that pivot slightly more. So I barely moved my hand, I just pivot. Pivot, you can see that slight concave from here to here. So that's what a pivot cut creates, a little bit of a, sorry, not that way, sort of concave. I'll do it once more, just really lightly. Yeah, that will do. Again, I want to put too much explanation and talk about form, because I think it's quite irrelevant for the first maybe 50 bowls. Just, you know, try and get the process. What you can see that this is quite rough still. My rim will be just here, so I'm going to push that bowl slightly shallower. And that comes back to what I said when I was axing. I don't like really deep and small bowls. I prefer a bit of a, you know, if it's going to be quite small a diameter, I don't want it to be too deep. Just, you know, that's what I favor. So I'll just have that rim a bit more refined from this side. And then I'll meet that rim from the other side when I do this face of the bowl. So that's my outside finish, I think. I'll take the bowl off the lathe and just have a little look on the form. So again, that's my rim there. I'm going to ignore that and just take that material down. Have a little foot, a little defined sort of point where that becomes in a concave. You know, it's not, again, it's not the perfect bowl, but it's just to show the process in a sort of fluid way while explaining. So now another drop of oil, which is now diluted with water from the rain. It's always good. It's a special recipe of rainwater and vegetable oil. It works the best.
Patented.
And then, you know, I was turning the bowl like that, doing the outside. I'm gonna stand exactly in the same place, so I'm gonna, you know, just flip the bowl round, having the face, the inside face towards me. Get it back into the same. It's really important making sure that you put the back of that center point in the same place and not bash a new hole, obviously, because you want to keep that same true line that you worked on the outside as well. Just grab the mallet, get the wedge nice and tight, make sure that it's held in centers. It's quite a common thing when teaching. You go around helping people and then you realize that got loose from, you know, from all that pressure you put with the tools on the bowl. You put a lot of force on it, so that tends to get loose especially when you catch, when you learn. If you catch really hard, that will get a bit loose. So it's really important every once in a while just make sure that it sits nice and firm in between the two centers. So it, you know, if it has a bit of a play, it will affect tremendously on how you cut the ball. Move that cord slightly. Now that I, you know, just a really quick pass or two, and it's already much more uniformed. I can just push it all the way out, and now I'm gonna take that axis wood until I hit my my rim. So we have that band of axis material and the rim that I want to keep, and I'll just push that material down until I reach that that rim. So same, you know, it's the same principle leading with cutting any aspect of the bowl. It's usually 12 o'clock up, face back of the tool on the face you're cutting, and then opening that angle slightly towards 1 or 2 o'clock will stop cutting. So just in a slight diagonal, just chasing that material down. You can see that I'm not trying to take loads of material at once. I'm breaking it into really small steps, and that just, you know, doing this sort of cut instead of that is just so much easier for the tool and for me. So I'm just doing really light cuts, just pushing that in. Keeping a nice steady rhythm. Just pushing that until I reach the actual face I want as my rim. And you can see that's my core here. I don't think I'll try, you know, we'll see how it goes, but I want to try and turn just a normal eating size bowl with a small core. But essentially, if I'll be nesting, that'll be more or less the size of core that I want to try and keep. And I can get a nice tiny sort of olive bowl from that core. So I pushed it all the way in, created a low spot here. So high, high and low. And it's the same principle with cutting with any edge tool. You always want to go from the high spot down to the valley. It's no different. So I can't really cut from here out. I can, if I want, I'll sorry, make it more accurate. If I want a nice finish, I can't cut from the valley out. I can only cut from the high spot down to the valley, down to the lowest point. So what I'm going to do is just keep on doing that all the way in, creating a low spot in the middle and coming with a nice clean cut from the rim towards that lowest point. And same with the core, I'll make it smaller and smaller and chase it in, working with the other tool. So maybe I'll show. So that's my main tool that I was using. So left side, bevel tip up, this one, which I did all of the outside with, except those finishing cuts. Now I'm going to use the same, essentially the same tool, only in a mirror image. So right hand bevel, tip up, but I'm going to use it with the tip down, and that just keeps a few cuts safer and easier to do, mainly chasing down the core, so thinning down that core. It's possible to do a whole bowl just with that tool. This tool, having that tool at hand, makes life slightly easier, because it's quite a hard thing anyway, chasing down the core when you start. So this tool just makes it slightly easier. So I'll use this one now. Using the tip down tool works in the same principle. So I'm using the back of the tool as my reference point. Only now I can't see the tip, so my 12 o'clock is now here. So when the tip is aiming to the 6 o'clock, because it's the other way around. If I'll, that will already start cutting now without changing the hour. But a slight towards 1 o'clock will cut even more. So you need to search, that 12 o'clock just almost cuts things. A really slight twist towards 12 and a quarter will cut really nicely. And now I'm just trying to chase that core slightly, creating a lower point. And changing the direction of the core. Instead of flaring outwards like it was, now I'm trying to push it in parallel to the mandrel, or even, if anything, cone shaped. So pushing it in towards the center of the bowl. I don't want it flaring out. I want to keep it under control and nice and tapered. So as I go deeper, I have more room for the other tool to work on the wall easily. So I might make the core even smaller. And I need to stop just before that tip is hitting the base of the bowl. Otherwise I will just catch. And then, that's a very obvious low point. So now I can really see my valley, and I can start working from that rim and creating nice cuts with I'll call this will be our secondary tool. So tip down and tip up will be our main tool, because essentially you're going to use it more. So just like we did the base of the bowl on the outside, if I want to cut this face, this will be essentially scraping. So it's not all, my reference point isn't, that's not correct as a reference point, because that's the face I'm cutting. Always the back of the tool is my reference point. So that will be scraping or catching, and that will be not cutting anything. So that's my 12 o'clock, my new 12 o'clock, which is, again, resembles 3 o'clock if I was to cut the rim. It's a lot of information, but hopefully that'll make sense if you see it or if you try it a few times. I'm always referencing to the back of the tool on the face I'm cutting. So if I'm cutting that face now, going inside, that's the face I'm referencing to. That means that's the back of the tool. The thing is, I need to be very careful with how I introduce the cutting edge. If I'll introduce too much, I'll just catch and snap the whole rim, and that's something that happens often to everybody. It still happens to me every once in a while if I'm not careful or not fully focused. You need to cut just the tiniest ribbon, tiniest bit of material, and that will give you a really crisp cut. If you try and cut too much, it'll be a disaster for the rim. It'll be quite funny for you behind the camera, but if you're trying to get a really nice crisp rim, you need to just make your way there. So I'm starting with the edge really far from the tool itself, so you know, I'm essentially tilting it that way and having contact just on that point, and I'll slowly get that cutting edge closer to the material. I'll make my way there rather than just trying to find it straight away. So I'm just rubbing the back of the tool slowly, and that's the sort of cut. So you can see how little I actually did before it started to cut. If I was to go to spin it more, that would be catching. So back of the tool, seeing the edge in the air, slowly rotating. Once it starts cutting, I'm just going with that. And stopping before the tip touches the core. So you can see that leaves a really nice finish as opposed to those roughing out cuts we did before. And that's what I'll try and produce as we go in. So do that once more. All the way in, and stop when I reach the lowest point, which is close to where it's starting to be uphill. So I pushed the cut slightly, you know, just repeating that, chasing the core down and then coming from the rim, from the rim down. Now I want to just make sure that I'm happy with the rim. If I'll come back to the rim, if I leave it sort of not as I want it, and come back to it when the bowl is already mostly hollowed, it'll have a lot of flex in it and it'll be very hard to get a really nice cut. I want to have all that resistance of the material so I can get a really nice cut just on the rim. I don't want any flex, you know, there's already flex in the wood as it is, but I want to keep quite a lot of material just so I can really put that tool nice and firm and cut a really nice cut on the rim. So because I'm cutting the rim, that's my reference point. So I'm cutting outwards, so back of the tool, on the face I'm cutting 12 o'clock, starting to spin, and then slowly just, ooh, so you see it still happens to me as well. So I cut just a tiny bit, so I'll clean that out as I did when I'm going in. I'll just clean that little catch, and then still there, but I think I'll manage to avoid it. Very lightly, just rounding off that edge. So it's nice and rounded. If there's any sharp corners on the rim, it'll break. It's not hard, it's not as strong enough. So I'm just rounding it off and meeting the shape I did from the outside. Also, I'm keeping things slightly thicker than I would usually because it's I'm using this spalted beech. So I'm compromising the thickness of the wall I would usually do to accommodate the fact that the wood isn't as strong as it was before it started spalting. So the spalting is essentially, it's rotting wood. It's not as strong as it was when it was freshly felled and cut. So it might be beautiful, but actually it's it will, if I'll do a really thin bowl, it will be quite weak. So I'm accommodating that. I'm allowing that spalting by adding a bit of thickness to the whole thing. So the rim is, at the minute, you know, it's not fragile, it's nice and strong. I rounded it off, and now I can choose where that wall is beginning. So I'll start. So now I set a point where the rim finishes and I'm starting the wall. Hopefully you can see that little step there. Just, you know, that thickness here is the rim, and beyond it I'm starting to dig deep. And that was using the finishing tool or the sharper tool. Now I'll go back. It's just because I'm a bit lazy. So instead of using one tool and sharpening all the time, I'm just using two. You don't need more than two tools to create just a bowl. So I'll go back to tip down tool. I'll push the core slightly further, deeper. And you can see how it's starting to be cone shape. So it's, you know, I'm tapering it in rather than letting it flare out as it wants to be. Created a new low spot, going back to my tip up tool and just removing material. I like to compare this cut to, a lot of bowl turners are familiar with hook knives for spoon carving. It's essentially exactly the same motion. So what we're trying to do is just, sorry, I won't spin the lathe, just create a little sweep with the tool. It's essentially exactly the same cut as it was if that was a bowl of a spoon and this was a tiny hook knife. You'd start from the high spot and just do that sort of motion to create a really smooth surface. So if you now follow the tool, you'll see that this is actually exactly what I'm doing. I'm constantly changing that angle, keeping the back of the tool against the surface, and that's what gives me a really nice clean cut, as opposed to, you know, if you would try and carve like that with a spoon knife, you know, it's very obvious what will happen. But for some reason, when people start turning, they don't see that connection. So that is essentially a tiny hook knife, and that is a bowl of a spoon. So if you follow, if you see now, once I start turning, what's happening, it'll be, maybe now you'll be able to see that it's actually a spoon knife and a bowl. And once again, so I'm starting sort of, you know, if this is our big clock now, that's 12 o'clock, that's 9, that's 6 o'clock. I'm starting somewhere, I'm starting the cut sort of 7 o'clock and finishing it more or less at 9 o'clock. Again, I took that sort of language from, I think Ben Offord uses it on the bowl and on the hook, and I just find it very accurate way of conversation, of, you know, everybody speaks the same language, which is really important, I think, when you teach. So 7 o'clock, back of the tool on the face I'm cutting, on that face, and I'm keeping that back as I go in. And finishing at in the valley. If I'll start cutting towards the core, I'll just catch. So now I hit that lowest point, I can go back to the tip down tool, chase that core slightly more. So I'm making room with each tool for the next tool. So that tool is making a new low point, that tool is cutting towards that point, and then they walk together. Each one is making room for the next one. So yeah, hopefully you stop before you catch. Okay, another low point. Back to the main tool, and now I'm starting to have a feel of thickness as well. So again, I said I'll try and keep it nice and thick to accommodate that spalting. So just making this is my fingers are the thickness gauge. Okay, all the way into that low point, back again. That spoon knife motion, constantly changing the angle until I reach the low point, making sure that I'm not going too thin or too thick. I want a nice even wall thickness, so I have a little step here. So instead of starting from here, I'll just slowly I'm making my way to the center of the bowl. And you can hear, I'll do it again, and maybe you can hear when I'm cutting downhill and when that is slightly changing to a flat and then uphill. And that sound is a good indicator as well as looking to when the cut isn't sweet anymore. So if you hear that is quite a sweet cut, still nice and sweet, now the angle is slowly changing, and so is the sound. So it's a bit more hard and scrapey. So that's the bottom, the flat, and now I'll, just to prove the point, I'll start cutting uphill towards the core, which is, we don't want to reach that point, but I'll start from the flat and just hear the difference in sound. Flat and that's uphill. That really not nice shearing sort of a cut. So you just don't want to reach that point. So still a bit more to do with this tool. I can work on the wall with this tool as much as I can, as much as I want, until that lowest point I created with the tip down. So one more pass with this. Check the evenness of the thickness of the wall. Quite happy with that. There's a few minor steps, but again, this is my roughing out tool. So I'll do another full pass with a sharp tool once I reach my ideal sort of thickness. I'll just trim down and make it nice and nice, and I'm missing a word. Smooth. Smooth. I'll put a bit of focus on this cut, which people find the hardest, I think, to begin with, chasing down the core, and even more when it gets deeper and deeper. Unfortunately, it looks, from experience teaching and from my own experience, the last cut with a core is the hardest. So you're starting out the outside, it's relatively, I'll call it easy or straightforward, because it's the same thing over and over again. Whereas when you start hollowing out the bowl, it's ever changing, the angle is always changing, and you're getting in a tighter and tighter space. So you can see how little maneuver I have with the tool to find that really sweet angle. And the deeper you go, the harder it gets. So essentially the very last cut you need to do on the bowl is the hardest. So it's worth practicing taking down that core over and over again. Start with a really big core. You can always trim it down, but if you start with a big core and you just practice that cut of making that diameter smaller and getting a nice smooth finish, you're essentially not only saving time on making your bowl, you're making your way towards nesting bowls naturally, because you're keeping it as big as you need. And if it's in the way, you can always trim it down more and more, and it's just a really good practice not to end up with a really shattered core. If you manage to create a really nice smooth core by the end of the bowl, that means that you're on the right track of also nesting. So you're doing two things at a time.
Right.
So that cut is hard, and I think a lot of people tend to come from this sort of parallel to the mandrel and centers, whereas as you go deeper, if you keep on coming from that angle, you can't, and that means that they'll twist it that way, and then that is 3 o'clock. So that will just be catching over and over again, and that's what happens in many cases. So if we're remembering that this is our sweet spot, back of the tool, that produces, you know, just the nicest curls and really nice cuts. If we remember that, you know, it's the same principle on the bowl and on the core as well, that will help us understand that if we're catching over and over again, that just means that we're not applying the tool in the right way. So to cut the inside of the core, we need to go lower down. So I'm under the center line, I'm under the mandrel, and that means that I can really push against the back of the tool and stabilize my cut, and that will help me get really nice cuts rather than just catching over and over again, which is so frustrating, you know, from experience. I just remember making maybe 5 bowls when I was staying with Sharif 4 or 5 years ago. I was making a bowl after a bowl, just each one of them I just didn't understand that cut, and then suddenly, you know, with the help of him and just with, you know, thinking, why am I catching all the time, you know, that sort of pumping motion that Sharif mentioned really helped, because that means that I'm on the safe spot. I'm relying on that back of the tool, and that's much closer. Not cutting anything is much closer to a sweet cut than catching, always. So if you're not catching anything, you're still in a better situation than just doing that time and time over and over again. So I'm underneath the core, underneath the mandrel. Also, that being said, I still catch sometimes. So, you know, it's just, you know, you need to practice it a lot and you'll still catch, but hopefully you'll be improving. So, you know, I'm still catching, but hopefully I'm improving time after time. So underneath that mandrels, way under, maybe even dare to say 6 o'clock. So it's right under, and just trying to find that sweet, that really sweet cut that produces, you know, the same curls that I produce on the wall. There's no reason why I shouldn't cut nicely on the core. Obviously, as I go deeper, I'll have less room for maneuver. But, you know, to begin with, this first 2/3 of the core, you should easily, you should be aiming for making a really nice crisp cut on the core as well. It's just worth practicing. So that's chasing down the core. As I go deeper, I have less room for maneuver and the cuts become a bit more rough and aggressive. But that's just because I'm as deep as I can. Okay, just to show that again, I'll cut from the beginning of the core all the way in. So I'm starting here, producing really nice shavings, really nice finish on the core, and making my way. As I go deeper into the bowl, I need to go lower under the mandrel. until I reach that point where I meet the high point of the wall. So hopefully that helps some people. I know that it was definitely the part that I was struggling the most. So back to my main tool, checking the thickness again. I'm quite happy with that thickness, sort of 1 inch in, but then after that it becomes quite thick, so I'll start trimming it down. Getting rough somewhere here. I don't need to look. I can just hear. Okay, I'm going uphill. You know, I literally go by the sound and the feel of the tool. I don't necessarily need to be looking the whole time what's happening. I can gauge from the sounds. I think I'm almost in my deepest point, coming from the direction of the core. Just a tiny bit more. So that will be, yeah, I think that'll be my lowest point from this direction, from the core. And now I need to just reach it with a nice even wall thickness to that lowest point. So I'm gonna swap to my nice sharp tool, because I don't have a lot of material to remove. I wanna just make it nice and even. So just taking those really nice long, thin cuts all the way in. Remembering my spoon knife, just one continuous, even though it's broken into loads of steps, small steps, it's still, I'm trying to achieve that one continuous curve with a tool. So that's almost there. Yeah, I'm happy with that. There's a little thick point in the base, so I'll go back to that. Have a little feel, still a bit thick. Just, it's really good to practice, you know, practice that feel with your fingers. Split a few bowls into half, you know, maybe your best bowl, split it, and then you'll understand how it feels and how it looks. It's not really worth splitting bad bowls, because if you know it's bad, you know, you don't need to look at it, you know it's bad already. But the really nice ones, the ones that feel like they have something different in them, that's the ones you want to split. That's what I do. With bowls less now, because I think I gauge it good. But with the cups, I have so many split cups from this summer, just to get an idea of how it looks when it feels good. Yeah, don't be too precious about things. I think, you know, if you take it as a learning experience, and not as a work of art or something that is so precious. You know, it was a log 1 hour ago. Why are we so connected and precious to it? You know, just 45 or an hour later. You know, try and enjoy the process of learning, and I think that's what I'm trying to do myself. And that's why people that come and learn for the first bowl, I just say forget about the bowl. Just try and learn how to use a hook knife. That's a hook tool. That's what you're here. If you're managing to produce this, that's what counts. That is sort of
a byproduct.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
At least, you know, that's my approach to things. That's why if I crack this bowl now, I'll still be happy and laughing. I won't be sad and sort of, oh, I can't believe I learned something. I learned about how to maybe introduce it in front of a camera. You know, that's how I try and do things. So a bit more refining. Just as you go towards the end of the bowl, you're trying to do a really refined cut, just touch those high ridges and not necessarily do full cut. I don't need to cut all the way from here to the base anymore because I'm happy with most of it. I just have a few bumps that I'm trying to remove. And again, you can hear when I'm changing that cutting from sweet downhill to slightly flat or uphill. Yeah, so keeping in mind that this is sort of a demonstration bowl and it's spalted wood, I would leave it at this thickness. I'm quite happy. It's a shame you can't really feel through the camera, but it's nice and it's quite thick on the base, and then as it goes towards the rim it tapers slightly. So that's the shape I'm chasing at the minute. Thick at the base, giving it nice weight and a slight taper as it goes to the rim. So that's, believe me, that this is how it is now. And it's slightly thicker than I would usually do, but yeah, that's what. So I chased the wall to that deepest mark I had from the secondary tool. From the, you know, I had the hook down tool making the deepest point of the bowl, and now I reached that point from the wall, making a few refinements just to make sure that I have a really nice smooth transition from the rim all the way to the center of the bowl. What I'll do now is the very sort of last two cuts, I guess. I'll use my finishing tool, my sharp tool, just to make sure that the bottom of the bowl isn't flat. So I want the bottom of the bowl to be, the center of the bowl wants to be the lowest point. So I want to reach right to that line. I don't want flat on the bottom. I just want a really nice continuous curve from the rim through the middle of the bowl to the other side of the rim. So I'll just make sure that I have that little concave that I want. So really thin shavings right in the bottom of the bowl. Watch that rim. So yeah, that should do it. So I just cut as deep as I can. If you look from here, so I started here, but instead of having a flat on the base, I tried and pushing it just slightly to that core a bit more to create a concave. And now the last thing that I need to do is just thin down that core to a size that I know for certain it will break. So I'm creating a weak point, a very distinctive weak point on the core, just above the base of the bowl, not on the base of the bowl, just a few millimeters above that base. So I know I crack it and I have a little scar to clean with a hook knife. So I'm using secondary tool, so hook down tool, chasing the core and just creating a really weak point right on the base. It's at the minute it's less than an inch, I think, But if I manage to push it even in a smaller diameter, I know, you know, I'm safe. I know for certain it'll break where I want it to. And then once we break it, you can see in your, you can see for yourself the sort of diameter I'm aiming for. So just chasing that core. Still relatively nice cut. And just making that weak point as small as I can. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that will do it. And then I can clean a tiny step with the main tool. Maybe I can, maybe I can't, maybe I can't. Just like turning, seeing turning marks as far down as I can. Yeah, that will break. So there's two options. You can break the core on the lathe itself while it's still held, or I prefer just to unmount it. When you whack the wedge out of the poppet, it's quite important putting a hand on the mandrel because it's still under tension, so it can fly off and break an expensive camera maybe. So just have a hand on the mandrel. And then it's really important having the end grain facing up and down, so you know, as the tree was growing, basically just looking at it as it was a log and breaking towards the side grain. That means that if those are the fibers, instead of ripping it that way and maybe creating a little hole, you're breaking it towards the short fibers. So you're breaking the fibers like that rather than like that. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm breaking it towards the side grain, and that's the sort of stump. So that can potentially be a tiny bowl as well. But yeah, I didn't try and keep it as big as I can, just for the sake of the demonstration. And then that little scar will be cleaned with a hook knife. Same for that scar. So yeah, it's
looking good.
It's okay. What's the wood? It's so beautiful.
So Yoav, we're in your apartment.
Yeah,
and this is a mobile van, isn't it? Mobile home. It's incredible what you've done with this. I think this will deserve a second video at some point. So now that we have the bowl,
yeah, it's
a mandrel. So we're going to clean this up. Is that correct?
Yeah. So yeah, broke it off the mandrel with a core, and last stage is just cleaning up that scar and this one, so we don't end up, you know, that will be the foot of the bowl where it sits, and all of that is access material. So I'm just going to use a hook knife, cutting. I like working like that. I don't know, again, it's not the only way, it's not necessarily the safest way. This is how I do things. Don't take it as the only way, or you know, this is just the way I do things. So I brace it between my legs, and I use a long-handled Elkayam, and using my...
And you're going across the grain?
Yeah, across the grain, just pivoting, and I want to clean just that stump. I really like leaving as much turning marks as possible, so I'm trying not to clean too much on the outside of that stump, just to make sure that I have a smooth transition. Very lightly, then it's still a bit high here rather than, and that's a bit lower, so I'll just shave that down a bit more. I just find it makes it that much more sweeter if, you know, that low point is right in the middle of the bowl. Just, yeah,
And needless to say, obviously, people will use whatever hook tools they have, basically.
Yeah. You can do it with any spoon knife. I tend to go with the long handles, just because I have much more power with less effort. And then with this, I can either do. So I'm just pivoting. So I don't know if it might look dangerous, but I'm not cutting towards me. I'm just twisting, and this thumb is keeping it, pushing it down. So there's no doing it in that way. There's no way I'll cut myself. If I'll start doing that motion, then this is extremely dangerous. Again, this is just the way I do it. So just twisting that handle and that thumb, pushing it down across the grain, cutting, cutting all the way, and then other side. And you can hear, I mean, obviously if we have experience turning, you can hear it on the lathe as well, but here it's even more obvious how much the speech is on the dry side rather than on the green. You can just hear those the way the spoon knife cuts the grain, that it's, it's not completely dry, it still has plenty of moisture, but it's definitely on the dry side. And then just going through, just cutting that. And one more pass. So again, that rotation. I wonder how many comments do you think there will be on this very dangerous cut underneath the YouTube video? That's it. 8. That's my guess. Just cleaning that, making sure I have a clean surface. Again, you can be as anal about it as you wish. Yeah, and that's the finished bowl.
So in terms of drying, what's your advice regarding drying? What do you typically do?
If it's thin bowls, again, there's so many opinions about it. I'm going into a fire zone regarding. I tend not to talk about oiling and drying too much, because people can just try and see.
But in terms of what you do, what do you personally do?
I turn quite thinly. Most of my bowls are thin and even thickness of the walls and base. So that means you can dry them quite aggressively. I have a wood burning stove here. We light it up quite often. I always put all the things in the van. I never stack things in shavings and piles and leave it outside for 10 days, putting inside for 5 days, and then I just put everything in the van like that. This is my drying shelf, or just on the windowsill. You can see all the cups. That's how they are. That's how they dry. Since I took them off the lathe, cleaned them, and I just stack it here. The reason I don't have a loads of bowls here is that I just didn't turn a lot of bowls this summer, and I'm very lucky to be able to sell most of the things I make. So the few things I made, I sold, to people as kind as yourself and other people that are interested. Usually in the van it takes, if the wood burner is on a few days on and off, for a bowl like that I would probably let it sit for a week or 2 weeks and have a feel, have a little hearing session. and I think I'll be confident enough to oil it before it's 100% dry. I'll oil it, you know, when it feels dry, and I'll be confident enough to say that it won't crack when people start using it. You know, that's just the way I do it. If it's thin, really thin end grain cups or really, really thin bowls, you can, you know, you can essentially make this place a sauna and dry them in over 2 or 3 days.
And what kind of oil do you typically use?
I use raw linseed oil, so cold pressed linseed oil for the bowls and spoons, and then a mix of beeswax and raw linseed oil for the end grain cups. And yeah, this one will look very nicely oiled. So a lot of the times I tend to use oil for myself. I don't like oiled spoons or stuff for my own use, but I think people quite enjoy seeing that grain shine, and especially with something that is quite figured, it'll look really nicely oiled. So yeah, raw linseed oil is what I choose.
So Yoav.
Hey Zed.
Hello. So this is a bit of an addition to the main video.
Yeah.
Because it turns out this bowl has dried. Do you reckon, in your opinion, it's dried out quite a bit?
Yeah, I think it can definitely dry a bit more, but this is the state sort of that I put some oil on it. It was outside in this beautiful weather, really windy and dry, so you know, you can see how oval it turned, and just it has most of the moisture is out of it by now. So this is the stage where I put some oil on it, some cold pressed linseed oil, and also turned a little bowl from that core.
Oh wow, nice.
So yeah, just really nice piece of wood. Was definitely big enough for a small bowl. Might be.
So you ended up turning a nested bowl essentially.
Yeah, just a tiny little set. Looks really
beautiful.
Really nice. So what I'm gonna do is just put some oil there.
The one with the larger lip, they look a bit like it goes under. Yeah.
Just nice seeing the grain and the colours that just pop out.
And to reinforce, this is obviously raw linseed oil. You'll not be using boiled linseed oil on anything that's coming in contact with edible food.
Yeah, you just want to use food safe oil. Yeah, that's lovely. Just nice using a bit of figured wood for a change. I usually use sycamore, or just things that are quite creamy and, you know, get the form really nicely out. But in this case, I think most people will look at this bowl and just say, "Ah, that's a lovely piece of wood," and not really refer to the form, which is, you know, it's good. It has its place. That's that one oiled, and then just that small one, and it's it's a perfect weather for just leaving them out and let the oil sit and dry.
And is it right when I say maybe once this is kind of fully cured and settled, maybe the first few uses you might get a slight taste in your food?
Yeah, I don't notice it anymore. My life smells and tastes like linseed oil. But yeah, I think a lot of people that aren't used to it will definitely have a different taste in the, you know, first few uses. What I tend to tell people is just before you use it, give it a really nice rinse with hot water. Really scrub it nice and well, let it dry, and it'll be much better than how it is without rinsing it before. So that's that set. Sits like that, I think. Hey Zed.
So guys, there you go, that is a wrap. Yoav, I cannot thank you enough.
Pleasure.
Seriously, thank you so much. I need to stress something that, you know, Yoav teaches this as his profession. He does this as his profession. It's his full-time thing. So I'm deeply grateful that he's taken the opportunity for me to come and film him and capture what you've just seen in this video. And so all I will ask from you is a very simple thing. If you gain any value from this whatsoever, all I ask is that you kindly go and check out Yoav's Instagram and his website. Obviously, I will put links below to both of those. It will mean the world to me for you to go check him out. It's kind of our way of saying thank you to Yoav for him sharing his process that he's seen here. Another thing, and obviously Yoav has stressed this throughout this video, this is what Yoav does. He's not saying this is the best, this is what you should be doing, this is simply what Yoav is doing. This is what has worked for him. I'll say this on my part, Yoav is an extremely well-respected craftsman within the green woodworking space and beyond. But my peers are, and maybe you'll agree yourself, that peers that have been doing it way longer still have such a huge amount of respect for Yoav and his work. And so for him, what you've just seen here now has just been an eye-opener for me, and hopefully for yourself too. So like I said, it will mean the world to me. It's just our way of saying thank you. Please do go check out his Instagram and website. Links will be below. What I'll also be doing is put a link to the woodland itself, run by Will St. Clair. This is where Yoav throughout the summer, so you're teaching lathe building, how to build a bow lathe, etc. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're doing a weekend sort of advanced turning, or not necessarily advanced, but one that is focused just on turning skills for people who already have a lathe or just interested in having a taster before they build a lathe for their own. And it includes also, we're setting up the forge. We did this year, it was the first time doing it. It was really lovely. So we're setting up a forge, putting a few lathes, having loads of wood, and then people can decide, it's quite a personal experience, so you can decide if you want to forge tools, spend the weekend only forging tools, or only turning, or do a bit of both. Just a really, a lot of time just on the lathe and on the tools, rather than building a lathe for 4 days like we do on the week-long course, which is 4 days of building a lathe and then 2 days of turning, or 2.5 days of turning. So both of these courses are good, for beginners or people that are already turning and want to perhaps see a different way of doing things, or see how I do things for some reason or another. So that's the courses I teach here, and then I'm assisting on chair making courses that Will teach, and there's spoon carving courses. Really, I'm so grateful to be able to spend the summers here in this spot. It was a bit noisy today, but it's usually all you hear is just birds and the fire crackling, and you sit and do the thing you want to do. And yeah, I'm super grateful for Will and Penny, his partner, just to having us here and having you here, and having the bowl gathering here. It's such a beautiful place, and it went to the most beautiful people that are sharing it with anybody that is interested in it. So that's a huge, it's maybe my way of thanking them, is maybe doing this video, or just acknowledging the fact that this is possible because of many other people and the situations that brought us to this spot.
It is genuinely an incredibly beautiful location. Got some amazing things happening here. So I will put a link below to Will St. Clair's website, and lastly I'll put a link to Sharif Adams' beginner's guide to kind of the lathe, building of the lathe, etc. So as always, I really do appreciate you watching. A huge sincere thank you once again to Yoav. As a last reminder, if you could please very kindly check out Yoav's links down below in the description. And who knows, maybe a future collaboration on some other work Yoav does. Yoav does some incredible work with spoon carving, turning other items, etc. And obviously if circumstances, logistics permit, then obviously we may be doing that in the future too. So I know this is a long video, but as you can see, there was a lot of steps involved. I hope we've done the best that we could to translate that across in video. I know it's very difficult to get every single nuance across on video, but hopefully we've done as best as we could. And really, I think the main thing is to go out there and do it. In terms of kind of really learning kind of the nitty gritty and how you apply what you have taught in this video to you doing it yourself. So, once again, really do appreciate you watching. And as always, from Yoav and myself, hope whatever you're doing, you have a blessed day, a blessed week ahead. Peace out.